The British general who watched American soldiers retreat through Kasserine Pass in February 1943 did not hide what he thought. He had seen enough of war to know the difference between a unit that had been defeated and a unit that had been broken. The Americans at Kasserine had been broken. Not by superior numbers. The German force that hit the American Second Corps on February 14th was smaller than the force it routed. Not by superior equipment. Broken by inexperience. By officers who did not know what to do when the plan failed. By men who had never been told what to do when the officer went down. In private, the British assessment was less diplomatic. Baby soldiers. That was the phrase moving through the British officer corps in North Africa in the spring of 1943. Enthusiastic, well-equipped, catastrophically green. Handed weapons they did not yet know how to use and sent against professionals who had been fighting since 1939. Rommel, who had driven the American Second Corps back more than 50 miles in 5 days, wrote about the Americans in his private papers with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating opponents. He noted the equipment, the logistics, the individual bravery, which was real and which had surprised him. And then he wrote something that the British officers quoting "baby soldiers" had apparently not read, or had read and chosen to ignore. He wrote that he had never seen soldiers learn so fast, not in France, not on the Eastern Front, not in the desert against the British, who had been fighting since 1940 and still made mistakes that the Americans had stopped making within months of their first engagement. The British heard "baby soldiers" and stopped listening. Rommel heard something else. He heard the sound of a system that was building something he had not yet faced. 6 weeks after Kasserine, the same American Second Corps, same men, same equipment, different commanders, stopped the 10th Panzer Division at El Guitar and sent it back with 30 tanks burning in the Tunisian sand. To understand what changed in 6 weeks, you have to go back to Fort Benning, Georgia, July 1941, to a program the British considered a bad joke that American NCOs initially considered an insult, and that produced more than half the combat officers who led American soldiers from Kasserine to the Elbe, the 90-day wonder. To understand it, you first have to understand what it was not. It was not what the name suggested. It was not 90 days of turning a civilian into an officer the way you turn raw metal into a finished part. The British looked at the 90-day timeline and saw a shortcut, a nation too impatient for the real work of producing officers. The British had reasons for thinking this. Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, ran a 2-year program. Before Sandhurst, the candidate needed the right schools. Before those schools, the right family, the right connections, the right address in the right county. The British system produced officers who had spent their entire adult lives becoming officers. When those men looked at a 22-year-old who had been a bank teller in Cincinnati 9 months ago and was now a second lieutenant with a commission from a 12-week course in Georgia, they saw exactly what they expected. They were not entirely wrong. Captain Charles MacDonald, 2nd Infantry Division, wrote about receiving a replacement officer fresh from OCS in 1944. The man arrived with no instinct for cover and concealment, no sense of the things soldiers know in their bones because they have been cold and wet and shot at. The sergeants gave the new lieutenant exactly the amount of trust his 90 days had earned him, which was none. This was the system's acknowledged failure mode. It was real, but it was not the system's only mode. What the British assessment missed, what every assessment that focused on the 90 days missed, was the question before the 90 days. Who was selected? What the Army was looking for when it sent a man to Fort Benning. The British selected officers by background, by family, by school, by the social signals that had reliably produced a certain type of man across several centuries. The Americans selected officers by test scores and by a quality the selection process described with characteristic directness as proven leadership ability. Not family, not school, not the right accent or the right regiment. Test scores and leadership, measured in basic training, measured by the men around the candidate. Peer ratings that gave the Army a picture of how a man was seen by the people he would eventually be asked to lead. The difference was not the 90 days. The difference was everything that happened before the 90 days began. The Army General Classification Test was not a prestigious examination, not a test of general knowledge, not a measure of education, a measure of one thing: the ability to learn quickly under pressure. The AGCT was administered to every man who entered the Army between 1941 and 1945, all 12 million of them. 40 minutes. Pattern recognition, verbal reasoning, arithmetic, spatial relationships. Designed by psychologists to answer one question no army had tried to answer at scale. Not what a man already knows, but how fast can he learn what he needs to know. 5 grades. To be considered for OCS, a man needed grade 1 or grade 2. Roughly 30% of the 12 million men who took the test qualified. That was the pool. From that pool, the Army looked for a second quality: leadership. Not the stated kind, the observed kind. The kind that showed up when men around a candidate asked who they would most want leading them in combat, wrote his name. The peer rating was what the British system had never tried to systematize. The British assumed the right background produced the right officer. A man who had been to the right school had been rated by his peers for years, informally, through an elite social environment that the British called leadership, without ever quite specifying what it measured. The American system made the rating explicit, formal, documented. It asked enlisted men, truck drivers, factory workers, farm boys, to identify the men among them who should lead them, and then it listened. The U.S. Army gave meaningful weight to the opinions of privates, men with no military experience, men who had been in uniform for weeks. The British General Staff found this incomprehensible, but the logic was sound, not theoretically, empirically. The men who would serve under these officers were the most reliable indicators of who could lead them. Leadership is not abstract. It is the specific quality of one man as perceived by the specific men he leads. A man who could not get privates with 2 months of training to follow him would not get combat veterans to follow him either. Dick Winters was selected for OCS because of his AGCT score and because the men at Camp Croft, South Carolina, pointed at him. 23 years old, economics degree from Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania, part-time jobs to pay tuition, enlisted 4 months after graduating, not, by any standard the British officer corps would have recognized, officer material. No family military tradition, no connection to any regiment, no schools a Sandhurst instructor would have recognized. What he had? A score in the top bracket of the AGCT and a basic training barracks where every man who was asked had written his name. In April 1942, the Army sent him to Fort Benning. The 12 weeks at OCS were not a compressed version of Sandhurst, different in design and different in purpose. Sandhurst produced officers who knew the British Army, its traditions, its protocols, its chain of command. A Sandhurst graduate arrived at his regiment knowing how things were done. He fit into an existing structure. OCS produced officers who could figure out what to do when the structure didn't exist. The curriculum: tactical problems without clear solutions, decisions under incomplete information and time pressure. Not what to do when the plan works, what to do when the plan fails, what to do when the sergeant goes down, when the radio is out and the map doesn't match the terrain, and men are looking at you, waiting to be told what happens next. The British thought this was a shortcut. It was a different destination. Winters graduated July 2, 1942, second lieutenant infantry, 11 months in the Army, 24 years old. 2 years later, June 6, 1944, Easy Company, Brecourt Manor, 4 German artillery pieces firing onto Utah Beach. No orders for that mission. No plan prepared in advance. He assessed the terrain, he placed his men, he attacked. The guns were silenced. A case study still taught at West Point. The British general at Kasserine had not been wrong about what he saw. He had been wrong about what it meant. He saw the failure mode of a system he did not understand and concluded the system was broken. Rommel drew a different conclusion. He saw men who did not yet know how to fight, and a system that could teach them. The question the British never asked: how many of them could the system produce? By July 1945, OCS had commissioned 120,000 officers, not from Sandhurst families, not from the right schools, from basic training barracks across the United States, selected by a 40-minute test and the written opinions of men who had known them for 8 weeks. More than half the combat officers in the United States Army. On April 8, 1940, General George Marshall stood before the Senate Military Affairs Committee and said something that no army in the world had ever made into official doctrine. He was testifying about officer training, about why the United States Army, 174,000 men, 17th in the world, behind Romania, behind Portugal, needed a different system than any army had used before. The committee expected numbers, training timelines, budget requirements. Marshall talked about something else. You have to lead men in war by requiring more from the individual than he thinks he can do. You have to inspire them when they are hungry and exhausted and desperately uncomfortable and in great danger. Only a man of positive characteristics of leadership, with the physical stamina that goes with it, can function under those conditions. And then, in a single sentence that separated what he was building from every military tradition before it: if leadership depends purely on seniority, you are defeated before you start. The British system depended on seniority. The German system depended on seniority filtered through intense professional training. Every major army in 1940 assumed that the right kind of man, produced by the right background, would eventually arrive at the rank where his leadership was required. Marshall was saying the system itself was wrong, not the men, the system. The European systems selected for a profile, developed over centuries, embedded in class structures that sorted men from birth. The selection happened before any military academy, in the families, the schools, the social world that told him from childhood his role was command. This produced confident officers who knew how to give orders because they had been giving orders their entire lives. What it did not reliably produce: officers who could think under pressure, who had learned, through not having everything given to them, to improvise. Marshall had a word for what he was looking for, not a military word, not from any army's doctrine. The word was initiative. He could not define it precisely, the quality that made a man, when the radio was out and the plan had failed and the sergeant was down, do something. Not the right thing necessarily. Something. The willingness to take responsibility for an action when all the formal supports had been removed. The British system trained men to operate within structure, the regiment, the battalion, the established procedures. Fine when the structure held. The structure had not held at Dunkirk in May 1940, when the entire British Expeditionary Force had been driven into the sea because the structure above it collapsed. Marshall was building a system that would function when the structure collapsed. The first OCS class at Fort Benning began July 1941. 204 candidates. The first graduation, September 27, 1941. 171 second lieutenants. Marshall himself gave the address. He titled the speech, "The Challenge of Command." He did not invoke the traditions of the officer corps, the history of the Army, the legacy of the regiments. He told them what he had told the Senate committee a year earlier, in different words. He told them that the test of an officer was not what he did when everything was working. It was what he did when nothing was. Professional competence is essential to leadership. Your knowledge of arms, equipment, and tactical operations must be clearly superior to that of your subordinates. At the same time, you must command their respect, above and beyond those qualities. Above and beyond, not instead of them. The technical competence was necessary, but not sufficient. The thing that made an officer worth following was something the 12 weeks at Fort Benning could not teach from a manual. It could only identify it, and put it under enough pressure to know if it was real. The 12 weeks at Fort Benning were not designed to be survived comfortably. They were designed to fail people. not arbitrarily. The attrition at OCS was engineered to answer one question. When everything goes wrong at once, what does this man do? A candidate was given a tactical problem. Move your platoon from point A to point B, secure the objective, report back. Then the radio failed. Then the map didn't match the terrain. Then the sergeant playing his NCO announced he had been killed. Then an unexpected obstacle appeared at the planned route. Then the time limit was cut in half. None of these complications were accidents. Instructors watched for one thing, not whether the candidate solved the problem correctly, but whether he kept moving. A candidate who froze, who waited for someone to tell him what to do when the situation had removed all the people supposed to tell him, that candidate was finished. Not because freezing was tactically wrong, because it was the one thing the Army could not fix later. Tactical knowledge could be taught in the field. Map reading improved with practice. The instinct to act when action was possible, to take responsibility in the absence of authority, that was either there or it was not. The washout rate was 25%. Sandhurst eliminated men who could not master the curriculum, the examinations, the social comportment expected. OCS eliminated men who could not lead when leading was the only option. The distinction was not obvious from the outside. It became obvious in combat. And in 1941 and 1942, neither the British nor the Americans had yet seen enough OCS graduates in combat to know which system produced what. Kasserine, in February 1943, appeared to answer the question in the British favor. It did not. What Kasserine revealed: OCS graduates in their units for 6 weeks, under commanders who did not trust them, executing doctrine untested against an opponent as experienced as Rommel's Afrika Korps, could not lead effectively in those conditions. The system did not send men to Kasserine fully formed. It sent men with the raw material of leadership, selected, pressure-tested, commissioned, and the expectation that experience would complete what Fort Benning had started. 6 weeks after Kasserine, at El Guitar, the same officers commanded the same men, different commanders, different doctrine, and the 10th Panzer Division went home with 30 tanks burning in the Tunisian sand. Not because the officers had changed, because the conditions had. The system that Fort Benning built was not designed to produce finished officers. It was designed to select men who could be finished by experience. Kasserine was the experience. El Guitar was the result. The British general who called them baby soldiers was right. They were. But the British system could not turn baby soldiers into experienced ones at the rate the war required. Sandhurst produced hundreds per year. The Army needed thousands per month. By mid-1943, OCS was commissioning 12,000 officers every 30 days. 12,000 every month. Truck drivers and teachers and store clerks and farmers, selected by a 40-minute test and the judgment of the men who had stood next to them in basic training. The British had been producing officers for 500 years. The Americans had been producing them for 18 months. And by the summer of 1944, the American officers commissioned through OCS were leading the largest invasion force in human history across the beaches of Normandy. At 6:30 in the morning of June 6, 1944, the landing craft doors dropped at Omaha Beach and the plan died. Not metaphorically. 27 of the 29 amphibious tanks assigned to support the 116th Regiment sank before reaching shore. Units landed in the wrong sectors. Officers went down in the first wave. Men from different companies, different regiments, found themselves pinned behind the same ridges of sand with no knowledge of who was in command or what the objective was. By 8:30, the 5th Corps commander was considering halting all landings at Omaha. The plan was gone. The structure had collapsed. What happened next was not in any manual. Across the length of Omaha Beach, junior officers and NCOs looked at the men around them, men they had not trained with, from units they did not know, in positions they had not been briefed on, and made decisions. Not coordinated decisions, individual decisions made by men who had been trained to make them when nothing else was available. Lieutenant John Spaulding of E Company, 16th Infantry, led his men up a gap in the German defenses above the beach, not on any map. He found it by moving forward when forward was the only direction that was not certain death. He took men with him. They cleared the position. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry walked upright along the beach under fire. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach," he said. "The dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." It was not a tactical plan. It was a demonstration that movement was possible. Men moved. Brigadier General Norman Cota came ashore and found Rangers huddled at the seawall. He did not consult a plan. He did not radio headquarters for orders. He looked at the men. "Rangers, lead the way." They led the way. The German commanders wrote in their after-action reports that the American attack did not behave like an attack. No single point to cut. No command node to destroy. Everywhere at once in small groups, making decisions independently. They were not wrong about the absence of coordination from above. The coordination above had been destroyed in the first wave. What they did not understand was that the Americans had been trained specifically for the absence of coordination from above. By the end of June 6th, American forces had a precarious foothold at Omaha, nearly 2,000 casualties. But the beach was not halted. The men who were not dead were off it and moving inland. The baby soldiers who had broken at Kasserine had been replaced by something the European military tradition had spent 500 years trying to produce and had never quite managed at scale. Men who knew what to do when nobody was telling them. That was the verdict of Omaha Beach, not the plan, not the numbers. The men that Fort Benning had selected, 12 weeks at a time, from basic training barracks across the United States. The men whose names had been written by men who had known them for 8 weeks and said, "This one. When things fall apart, this one." At Fort Benning, in 12 weeks, the Army had not taught them what to do at Omaha Beach. It had selected the men who would figure out what to do at Omaha Beach. The radio was out. The map didn't match the terrain. The sergeant was down. The men were looking at them. They kept moving. The British general who had called them baby soldiers at Kasserine was not present at Omaha Beach, but his counterpart was. British officers were embedded throughout the Allied command structure in Normandy, observing, advising, coordinating. They had been doing this since 1942, since the Americans arrived in England with their equipment and their enthusiasm and their catastrophic inexperience, and the British had assumed, naturally and not unreasonably, that their role was to teach. By June 1944, the teaching relationship had quietly reversed, not in any formal sense, but in the specific observations of British officers watching American units in the field. A pattern had emerged that no one in the British command had quite predicted. The Americans were better at chaos, not at discipline. The British soldier was more disciplined in the parade ground sense, better turned out, more formally deferential to rank. The Americans were, as British officers had been saying since 1942, sloppy. Their salutes were approximate. Their uniforms were approximate. But put them in a situation where the hierarchy had been removed, where the officers were down and the plan was gone, and the men had to figure out what to do next. And something happened that the British had no ready framework for describing. They acted. Not all of them. The system produced failures alongside successes. Some of the 75% who graduated turned out, under fire, to belong in the 25. The replacement system produced, alongside its Dick Winterses, its Lieutenant Sobels, officers who had the rank without the quality the rank was supposed to represent. But the ratio. The ratio was what the British had not anticipated. The number of American junior officers who, when the structure collapsed, kept moving, kept deciding, was higher than anything the British system had produced in the same period. Not because American men were braver. The British had fought at Dunkirk and El Alamein and demonstrated repeatedly that courage was not uniquely American. Because the American system had selected for the specific quality that chaos required. The British system selected men who could operate excellently within a functioning structure. The Sandhurst graduate arrived knowing exactly how things were done. Excellent when his role was clearly defined, when the chain of command was intact. Remove the structure, and you had a man who had spent his entire formation being told how things were done, and suddenly no one was telling him what to do instead. The OCS graduate arrived at his unit knowing almost nothing about how things were done. He had 12 weeks of pressure-tested tactical problems and a peer rating that said other men trusted him. He had been selected for the quality of acting in the absence of authority. Remove the structure, and you had a man who had been selected specifically for that moment. This is not a criticism of British officers. It is a description of what two systems optimized for. The British system had been built over centuries to produce officers for the British Army as it existed. It produced exactly what it was designed to produce. The American system had been built in 18 months to produce officers for an army that did not yet exist. It produced exactly what it was designed to produce too. The difference was the condition each system had been designed for. The American system had been designed for the condition where everything goes wrong, where the plan fails, where the radio is out, where the only question is whether the man looking at the men looking at him will keep moving. At Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, 16 months after Kasserine, 2 years after the first OCS class graduated at Fort Benning, the answer to that question was given at scale, across miles of beach, by thousands of men simultaneously. None of them had been briefed on the specific problem they solved. They had been briefed in 12 weeks at Fort Benning on the general problem. When everything is gone, you keep moving. The answer was yes. The British General Staff reviewed the after-action reports from Normandy and updated their assessments. The language was careful, professional, diplomatic. But the phrase "baby soldiers" does not appear in any British assessment written after June 1944. The German officer who sat across from an American interrogator in the autumn of 1944 had been trained for 4 years, not 12 weeks. 4 years of formal military education at Kriegsschule, followed by rotations through infantry units, weapons schools, and the kind of cross-training the German system had developed over decades. He was, by any objective measure, better trained than the man questioning him. He was also a prisoner. The German system had produced extraordinary officers. The officers who led panzer columns through France in 1940, who improvised brilliant defenses in North Africa, who fought the Red Army to a standstill. These were men of genuine military excellence. The doctrine of Auftragstaktik, mission command, the freedom to act on the commander's intent without specific orders, had produced something the Americans openly envied. But the German system had a constraint the American system did not. It was a constraint of time. The Wehrmacht officer who graduated from Kriegsschule in 1938 had taken 2 years after initial service, designed for peacetime production rates. In 1939, Germany had approximately 100,000 officers. By 1944, it needed 3 times that number. The pipeline could not scale. By 1943 and 1944, the German system was compressing. The 4-year path became 2 years, then 1. Schools were rushed. The men arriving at the front were products of the system under pressure, the same pressure the American system had been under from the beginning, except the American system had been designed for that pressure. The AGCT took 40 minutes. The peer rating took 8 weeks. Fort Benning took 12. Civilian to commissioned officer, 8 months. The German accelerated wartime path, even shortened to 1 year, was 50% longer. The American system produced 12,000 officers per month at peak. Germany could not approach that number. But the numbers alone do not tell the whole story. The deeper constraint was cultural. Auftragstaktik was brilliant when the officers who held it had been through the full formation the system was designed to produce. When they understood, through years of education and field experience, not just what the commander wanted, but why. Take away the years of formation, and Auftragstaktik became an officer who had been told to act on intent, but had not been given the formation to understand what intent meant in complex conditions. The doctrine without the experience that made the doctrine functional. The American system had not given its officers Auftragstaktik. It had given them something cruder and more durable, the habit of acting in the absence of authority. Not the sophisticated officer who understood the commander's intent across the entire theater. The lieutenant who, when the sergeant went down and the radio failed and the men were looking at him, did something. After the war, in systematic debriefings of captured German officers, a pattern emerged. They respected American equipment. They respected American logistics. What surprised them, the thing they returned to repeatedly, was the junior officers. Not the generals, the lieutenants. The lieutenants who kept fighting when the plan had failed, who organized men from units they had never met, who attacked positions they had not been briefed on because the position was there and the men were behind them. The German system had tried to produce that quality through 4 years of formation. The American system had tried to identify it in 8 weeks of basic training. Both systems got it wrong. The German accelerated wartime program produced officers with the doctrine without the formation. The American replacement pipeline produced officers who had neither. But at the scale that the war required, the American system identified the quality more reliably than any system based on length of training alone. Because the quality was not produced by training, it was selected for by a 40-minute test and 8 weeks of peer observation. The training came after. The quality came before. The man who designed the OCS selection system did not live to see it work. General George Marshall testified before the Senate in April 1940 and described what he was looking for. He established OCS at Fort Benning in July 1941. He gave the graduation address to the first class in September 1941 and told 171 new second lieutenants that the test of command was not what a man did when everything was working. Marshall ran the United States Army through the entire war. He watched OCS produce 120,000 officers. He watched them go to North Africa, get beaten at Kasserine, come back 6 weeks later, and stop the 10th Panzer at El Guitar. He watched them land at Omaha Beach and improvise their way off it. He never once claimed credit for what those officers did. Marshall understood, better than almost anyone, what he had built and what he had not built. He had not built the quality. He had built a system for finding it. The distinction mattered. He had spent 30 years watching the Army promote men without the quality and fail to recognize men who had it. The promotion system rewarded seniority and punished initiative. Brilliant officers stagnated while men with connections advanced. He had created a pathway that bypassed the old filters. If you score in the top 30% on a 40-minute test, and if the men standing next to you think you should lead them, you will get the chance. Regardless of family, school, connections, or rank. This was, in the context of 1941 American society, a radical statement. Not politically radical. Radical in the specific sense of going to the root, cutting through the layers of social selection that determined, in most armies, who got the opportunity. The peer rating was the most radical element. The Army had built a formal mechanism by which a private who had been in uniform for 8 weeks could determine whether a man from a good family in Connecticut became an officer, and treated that rating as actual weight in an actual selection decision. Not the appearance of democracy, real input. The British thought this was chaotic. The Germans would have found it puzzling. Marshall had a reason for it that neither the British nor the Germans had articulated. Leadership was not a quality visible to superiors. It was a quality visible to subordinates. A general could assess a colonel's tactical judgment, but the quality that made a man worth following into fire, the specific quality soldiers detect before they can name it, was visible to the men who would do the following, not to the men above, to the men alongside. They had not learned to confuse confidence with competence, or social ease with tactical intelligence. They evaluated the man directly, without the filters that institutional life imposes. The result was a system that found, in the first years of the war, Men every previous American military system would have passed over. Men whose families had not told them since childhood that their role was command. Men who had worked in stores and on farms and in factories and had never thought of themselves as leaders until the army asked the men around them, and the men around them said yes. Those men existed in every barracks in every training camp across the United States. The old system had no way to find them. The AGCT and the peer rating gave Marshall the instrument to find them at scale, 12,000 per month, and send them to Fort Benning to discover whether what the men around them had seen was real. Dick Winters had been a part-time laborer putting himself through an economics degree at a small college in Pennsylvania. The men at Camp Croft had written his name. He led Easy Company from Normandy to the Eagle's Nest. Marshall had not made Dick Winters. He had built a system that found him. That was the verdict, not the training, the finding. In the spring of 1945, a British officer attached to an American headquarters sat down and wrote a report. He had been observing American operations for 18 months. He had read the Kasserine after-action reports with the satisfaction of a man whose prior judgments had been confirmed. He had come ashore in France after D-Day and spent the campaign from the Seine to the Rhine, attached to American units, observing, taking notes. His report was addressed to his commanding general, not published. A professional assessment written by a man with no reason to flatter and every incentive to be accurate. The report noted American logistical superiority in unreserved terms, American firepower, the industrial capacity that had produced in 4 years an army of 8 million men equipped at a level no other nation had approached. And then, in the section on junior officer quality, it said something that would have been unthinkable from a British officer in 1943. It said the Americans were good, not adequate, not surprisingly capable given limited training, good. Specifically, tactically good. Good at leading men in situations no one had anticipated, making decisions in the absence of authority, keeping units functional when the structure above had failed. The British officer wrote that he had initially found American junior officers lacking in the formal qualities his training taught him to look for: the salutes, the dress, the procedural knowledge of how things were done. What he came to understand through 18 months of observation, those qualities were not what made junior officers effective in combat. What made them effective was the quality the Americans had been selecting for since 1941, the willingness to act in the absence of authority. He used a different phrase, more British in its understatement. American junior officers demonstrated consistently and at scale a capacity for independent action under adverse conditions that exceeded what he had observed in any other Allied force. Independent action under adverse conditions. That was the verdict. 3 years after Kasserine, 18 months after the first OCS class had graduated at Fort Benning. It had taken 3 years. Kasserine and El Guitar and Omaha Beach and the hedgerows of Normandy and the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The full, terrible cost of learning how to fight while fighting. The cost every army pays that has not fought recently. But the system had produced what it was designed to produce, not perfect officers, not 4 years of Kriegschule or 2 years of Sandhurst. Officers selected at scale for the specific quality the war required, the ability to keep moving when everything else had stopped. Marshall had testified before the Senate in April 1940 and said that if leadership depends purely on seniority, you are defeated before you start. By the spring of 1945, the Army had 8 million men commanded at the junior level by officers selected not by seniority, not by family, not by school, but by 40 minutes on a test and the written judgment of men who had stood next to them for 8 weeks. The British general who said baby soldiers after Kasserine was not wrong about what he saw. He was wrong about what it meant. He saw a system that had not yet worked. the failure mode of something still learning. Men who did not yet know what they were capable of, led by officers who did not yet know it either. What he did not see, what no one could have seen in February 1943, was what the system was building. The army that crossed France in the summer of 1944 faster than any army had moved since Napoleon. The army that held Bastogne when the German armored divisions closed around it. The army that crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and reached the Elbe in April. Not the army Marshall had, the army Marshall was building. One test, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and the written opinions of men who had been in uniform for 2 months and knew, without being able to say exactly how, that this particular man, from this barracks, in this training camp, in this city or town or farm, was the one. When things fall apart, this one. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The officers who had led American units from North Africa to the Elbe went home. The system that had produced them was demobilized. Fort Benning closed its OCS program. The 12,000 officers per month pipeline shut down. The men who had been bank tellers and farmers and store clerks and teachers went back to being those things. Most never talked about what they had done. Most, if asked, said they had just done their jobs. They had done their jobs. The jobs they had been selected for, not trained for, selected for. The men whose instinct, when the structure failed and the men were looking at them, was to keep moving. The British general who had called them baby soldiers had updated his assessment, officially in reports. Privately, in the way men who have been wrong adjust their understanding of how the world works. He had been right about what he saw at Kasserine. He had been wrong about what it meant. The British system looked at 12 weeks and saw a shortcut. Peer ratings from privates, chaos. Men from the wrong families and schools, not officers. It was looking at the wrong thing. The question was not how long the training was, but what it was for. Not who the family was, but what the peer rating said. Not whether the man knew how things were done, but what he did when things were not being done and no one was telling him what to do instead. These are, in retrospect, obvious questions. Marshall had asked them in 1940. They were not obvious then. They became obvious in 1943 and 1944, when the American Army was tested in the field and the system had to demonstrate, under fire and at scale, whether the theory was correct. The theory was correct. The British had looked at 12 weeks of training and seen a dangerous shortcut. What they had not seen was the 40 minutes before it and the 8 weeks before that. The three elements together, test, peer rating, pressure, were not a shortcut. They were a different kind of selection, built for a different kind of war. Not perfectly, not without cost. For every 4 men Fort Benning sent to the field, 1 had been found lacking and sent back. Some of the 75% who graduated lacked it too. The field found them out. Some of the best died in the first weeks of their first deployment. The system was not perfect. It was better. Better than family and school. Better than seniority. Better than any system that assumed the quality could be produced by the right formation over the right number of years. Because the quality was not produced by formation, it was found by asking the men who stood next to the candidate for 8 weeks to say what they saw. In May 1945, the men identified that way came home. They had gone to North Africa and Sicily and Italy and France and Belgium and Germany. They had kept moving when the plan failed and the radio was out and the sergeant was down and the men were looking at them. They had done their jobs. The British had called them baby soldiers. Rommel had said he had never seen soldiers learn so fast. By May 1945, Rommel was dead, and the army he had commanded had surrendered, and the baby soldiers were on their way home. They had learned fast enough. The system that found them had worked. Not because it was the best system anyone could imagine, because it was the right system for the specific problem. How do you produce, in months rather than years, officers who will keep moving when everything stops? You do not produce them. You find them. You give them a test. You watch them for 8 weeks. You listen to what the men around them say. You send them to Fort Benning. And then you send them to where the pressure is real. Marshall understood this in 1940. The British understood it in 1945, when they wrote that American junior officers demonstrated, consistently and at scale, independent action under adverse conditions that exceeded any other Allied force. The German officers understood it in the interrogation rooms, describing with professional precision lieutenants who kept fighting when the plan was gone and the structure was gone, and there was nothing left but the men and the decision. They kept moving. That was the answer to the question the British had been asking since Kasserine. That was what the baby soldiers became.